It's a scorching afternoon in West Texas, 1857. You're a cavalry soldier stationed at Camp Verde, about 60 miles northwest of San Antonio. You're walking back from patrol when you see something that makes you stop dead in your tracks. Standing in the corral, chewing methodically and staring at you with enormous brown eyes, is a camel. Not a horse, not a mule. A camel. 7 feet tall at the shoulder with a hump on its back and an expression that suggests it's deeply unimpressed with Texas. Welcome to one of the strangest experiments in American military history. Between 1856 and 1866, the United States Army imported camels from the Middle East and stationed them in the American Southwest. Not as a joke, not as a publicity stunt, as a serious military experiment to solve a very real problem. And here's the remarkable thing: it worked brilliantly. The camels were stronger than mules, tougher than horses, and perfectly adapted to desert conditions. They could carry incredible loads, go days without water, and thrive in heat that killed other animals. So why did the experiment fail? That's the story we're going to tell tonight. A tale of ambitious thinking, cultural resistance, the chaos of civil war, and wild camels roaming the American West for decades after the Army abandoned them. It's a true story that sounds like fiction, and by the end, you'll wonder why we're not still using camels today. To understand why the Army wanted camels, you need to understand the problem they were trying to solve. In the 1850s, the United States had just acquired massive new territories from Mexico: Texas, California, New Mexico, Arizona. Suddenly, the Army needed to establish forts, patrol borders, and maintain supply lines across hundreds of miles of brutal desert. The problem? Horses and mules were dying. The Southwest wasn't like the East. There was no grass for grazing. Water holes could be 50 miles apart. Summer temperatures reached 120 degrees Fahrenheit. The rocky terrain shredded hooves. Thorny desert plants left animals bleeding and infected. A cavalry horse needed water every day, at least 10 gallons. A mule could go a bit longer, but not much. And both animals needed grain or good grazing to maintain their strength. Supplying them was a nightmare. Wagon trains had to carry tons of grain and locate water sources every single day. If they miscalculated, animals died. Sometimes entire pack trains collapsed, leaving soldiers stranded in the desert. The mortality rate for Army horses and mules in the Southwest was staggering. Some estimates put it at 50% or higher within the first year. The Army was spending a fortune replacing animals. Worse, the constant logistics of feeding and watering limited how far patrols could venture. Vast stretches of territory went unpatrolled simply because horses couldn't survive the journey. Someone needed a better solution. That someone was Jefferson Davis. Yes, the Jefferson Davis, the man who would later become President of the Confederate States. But in 1853, he was Secretary of War under President Franklin Pierce, and he had an idea that was either brilliant or insane, depending on who you asked: camels. Davis had read accounts from explorers and military officers who'd served in North Africa and the Middle East. They described camels as nearly miraculous animals, capable of carrying 600 to 1,000 pounds, traveling for days without water, thriving in heat and terrain that killed horses. If camels worked in the Sahara and Arabian deserts, Davis reasoned, why wouldn't they work in the American Southwest? It wasn't a completely new idea. The French had used camels successfully in Algeria. The British used them in India. Even George Washington had briefly considered importing camels during the Revolutionary War, though nothing came of it. But Davis was the first American official in a position to actually make it happen. In 1855, Congress appropriated $30,000 for the experiment. That's roughly $1 million in today's money. Not a huge sum, but enough to purchase camels and transport them across the Atlantic. Davis assigned the mission to Major Henry Wayne of the Quartermaster Department and Navy Lieutenant David Dixon Porter. Their orders: sail to the Mediterranean, purchase the finest camels available, hire experienced handlers, and bring them back to Texas. It was easier said than done. Wayne and Porter departed in 1855 aboard the USS Supply, a Navy storeship that had been specially modified with padded stalls, canvas slings, and reinforced decking to carry camels. Their first stop was Tunisia, but the local rulers were suspicious and unhelpful. Next, they tried Malta, Egypt, and finally Turkey, where they had better luck. In the markets of Smyrna and Constantinople, they purchased camels, both the single-humped dromedaries from Arabia and the shaggier double-humped Bactrian camels from Central Asia. They also hired handlers, 5 Middle Eastern men experienced in camel care, including a Syrian named Haji Ali, whom the Americans immediately nicknamed High Jolly. Buying the camels was one challenge. Getting them across the Atlantic was another. Camels, it turns out, don't like boats. They're desert animals, adapted to stable, dry ground. The rolling motion of a ship at sea made them seasick, irritable, and prone to lying down and refusing to move. The crew built special slings to keep the camels upright during rough seas. They fed them hay, rice, and beans, whatever they could get the animals to eat. Fresh water was rationed carefully. Fortunately, camels don't drink much. The voyage took 3 months. When the USS Supply finally arrived in Indianola, Texas, in May 1856, 33 camels disembarked. One had been born during the voyage, the first camel born under the American flag. The local Texans gathered at the docks, staring in astonishment. Most had never seen anything like these strange, humped creatures shuffling down the gangplank. The camels stared back, equally unimpressed. The Army established Camp Verde as the headquarters for the Camel Corps, about 60 miles northwest of San Antonio. It was an ideal location, remote, hot, and surrounded by the kind of terrain the camels were supposed to conquer. Major Wayne oversaw the initial training and testing. The goal was simple: prove that camels could outperform horses and mules in desert conditions. The results were stunning. In the first endurance test, camels carried loads of 600 pounds, more than double what a mule could manage, across rocky terrain without strain. They moved at a steady pace of about 3 miles per hour, matching the speed of loaded mules, but carrying far heavier loads. Water consumption was even more impressive. A horse needed 10 gallons of water per day. A mule needed slightly less. A camel. They tested it rigorously. One camel went 5 days without water in summer heat and showed no distress. Another went 8 days. When they finally did drink, they could consume 25 gallons in just a few minutes, rehydrating completely in one session, then going days again without needing more. The feed requirements were equally remarkable. Horses and mules needed grain, expensive to transport and store. Camels browsed on desert shrubs that other animals wouldn't touch: creosote bush, mesquite, prickly pear cactus, spines and all, even greasewood. They turned useless desert vegetation into usable energy. One officer wrote in his report, "They eat what no other animal will touch, drink half as much as a horse, and carry twice the load." If we could convince the men to use them, we could revolutionize supply in the Southwest. But that "if" was a big problem. The soldiers hated the camels, not because the camels didn't work. They worked brilliantly. The soldiers hated them because they were strange, smelly, and utterly terrifying to horses. Let's start with the smell. Camels have a distinctive odor that's hard to describe but impossible to ignore. It's musky, pungent, and seems to permeate everything nearby. The handlers got used to it. The soldiers never did. Then there was the temperament. Camels are intelligent animals, but they are not domesticated in the same way horses are. They're stubborn. They hold grudges. If you mistreat a camel, it will remember, and it will wait for revenge. Camels bite. They kick and they spit. Not just saliva, but regurgitated stomach contents that reek like nothing else on earth. Soldiers learned quickly never to stand in front of an angry camel. But the biggest problem? Horses absolutely panicked around camels. Cavalry horses, trained for battle, accustomed to gunfire, would lose their minds when they encountered a camel. They'd rear, bolt, throw their riders, and sometimes injure themselves trying to escape. Mule trains would scatter. Wagon teams would stampede. One incident in San Antonio saw a camel cause chaos when it wandered too close to the town plaza. Horses tied to hitching posts broke free and galloped through the streets. A freight wagon overturned. It took hours to restore order. The cavalry troopers, proud of their horsemanship and deeply attached to their mounts, blamed the camels. Why should they abandon their horses for these ugly, smelly, foreign creatures that spooked every other animal? The cultural resistance ran deeper than practicality. Camels were associated with the Middle East, with exotic foreigners, with a world that seemed alien to American soldiers. Using them felt wrong, un-American somehow, even when the evidence clearly showed they were superior for desert work. Major Wayne tried everything. He organized demonstrations. He produced detailed reports with statistics proving the camel's superiority. He even tried breeding programs, hoping that American-born camels might be more acceptable to the men. Secretary of War Davis remained enthusiastic, requesting more funding to expand the program. In 1857, a second shipment arrived, 41 more camels, bringing the total herd to 74 animals. But Davis was fighting a losing battle against culture and tradition. And then, in 1861, everything changed. The Civil War destroyed the Camel Corps before it ever had a chance to prove itself. When Texas seceded from the Union in February 1861, Camp Verde and its camels fell into Confederate hands. Jefferson Davis, now President of the Confederacy, had more urgent concerns than experimental pack animals. The camels were scattered. Some were sold at auction. Others were used sporadically by Confederate forces in Texas. A few were seized by Union troops during later campaigns. But nobody really wanted them. Both armies had the same problem the peacetime army had faced. Soldiers preferred horses, even when camels were objectively better. After the war, the surviving camels were auctioned off in batches. Some went to circuses. Others were sold to mining companies in Nevada and Arizona, where they hauled equipment in desert conditions, and some were simply released into the wild. For decades afterward, wild camels roamed the American Southwest. Prospectors reported seeing them in remote canyons. Railroad workers spotted them near tracks in Nevada. Cowboys would occasionally encounter a camel browsing on desert scrub and wonder if they were hallucinating. One famous camel, known as the Red Ghost, terrorized Arizona Territory in the 1880s. Witnesses described a reddish camel with something strapped to its back, charging at people and livestock. When it was finally shot in 1893, they discovered a skeleton tied to its saddle, the remains of a rider who'd apparently died and been left lashed to the animal years earlier. The last confirmed sighting of a wild descendant of the Army's Camel Corps was in Texas in 1941, 80 years after the experiment officially ended. So why did it fail? It wasn't the animals. The camels performed exactly as promised, superior to horses and mules in every measurable way for desert work. It wasn't the cost. Even with shipping expenses, camels were economically viable. One camel could do the work of 2 mules, live longer, and require less support. It failed because of people. Soldiers didn't want to learn new skills. Officers didn't want to retrain their men. The entire culture of the U.S. Army was built around horses. Cavalry traditions, horsemanship is a mark of status, the romantic image of mounted soldiers. Camels didn't fit that image. They were foreign, unglamorous, and associated with cultures that Americans viewed as inferior. The timing was also catastrophic. Just as the experiment was gaining momentum, the Civil War consumed all attention and resources. By the time the war ended, the camels were scattered, the handlers had moved on, and institutional memory was lost. Nobody wanted to restart the program. The Transcontinental Railroad was expanding, making long-distance desert supply lines less critical. The Indian Wars were winding down. The need for camels, urgent in the 1850s, seemed less pressing by the 1870s. And so, one of the most successful military experiments in American history, was forgotten. But here's what's fascinating. The Army was right. Camels were the better choice for the Southwest. Modern environmental historians have studied the experiment and concluded that if the Camel Corps had been fully implemented, it could have dramatically reduced the Army's logistics costs, expanded patrol ranges, and decreased animal mortality. The Australian military learned this lesson. When Britain needed pack animals for desert campaigns in Australia, they imported camels, thousands of them. They worked so well that Australia still has a wild camel population today, descendants of those imported animals. The U.S. military, meanwhile, went back to horses and mules. It wasn't until World War I, 60 years later, that the Army finally moved beyond animal power to motorized vehicles. You can still find traces of the Camel Corps today. At Camp Verde, historical markers tell the story. In Arizona, old miners' trails are still called camel roads. Hi Jolly, the Syrian handler, is buried in Quartzsite, Arizona, under a pyramid-shaped monument topped with a metal camel. And somewhere in Texas, there are probably genetic traces still, distant descendants of those first camels, their DNA mixed into modern herds imported much later for zoos and private collections. The experiment worked, the animals succeeded. Only the culture failed to adapt. Tonight, as you drift off to sleep, picture those camels standing in the Texas desert, 1857. The sun is setting, turning the sky orange and purple. The heat of the day is finally fading. A lone camel stands silhouetted against the horizon, chewing methodically, its long shadow stretching across the sand. It doesn't know it's part of an experiment. It doesn't care about Army logistics or cultural resistance. It's just a camel doing what camels do, surviving in a harsh environment with casual efficiency. And for a brief, strange moment in American history, the U.S. Army almost got it right.